Hi, welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis. The question for today is, what is the second best Beach Boy album? The Shemp Howard of the Beach Boys canon, so to speak. You know, pretty much everybody agrees, 10 out of 10, that Pet Sounds from 1966 is the great Beach Boy album of all time, and I won't dispute that. A more difficult question to answer is, what's the second best Beach Boy album of all time? Now, a lot of bands, there's kind of a clear consensus as to what's number one and number two. For example, the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper, almost always ranked number one. Common consensus then is second best being Revolver. Now, in the last 10 years or so, a few people have started to flip the order there and list Revolver one and Sgt. Pepper second. But I think general consensus still would be Sgt. Pepper, Revolver. More clearly would be the example of John Lennon. 1970s Plastic Ono Band, almost always ranked as the greatest John Lennon album, followed by 1971's Imagine. Now, I agree with that ranking. Personally, I'd rather listen to Walls and Bridges because I'm more of a pop guy, but I can understand why critically Plastic Ono Band, Imagine would typically be ranked number one, number two as far as John Lennon albums. Likewise, Marvin Gaye, you've got What's Going On, great album, almost always ranked number one among Marvin Gaye albums, followed by Let's Get It On, almost always considered the second best Marvin Gaye album. Other artists with a similar sort of one and two, you've got Van Morrison, Astral Weeks, at almost always coming in at number one. And then for most people, and there may be some dissent on this, the second best Van Morrison album is Moondance. Elton John, that gets a little dicier. Most people will agree Goodbye Yellow Brick Road is the number one Elton John album of all time. Just a lot to it. I love this album. Let me show you the inner sleeve in case you're not familiar with this thing. Big gatefold. You know, it's the kind of album you could just really get lost in. Almost everything on it could have been a hit single, and there obviously were many hit singles on it. I think most people would rate as number two Honky Chateau. Could be some dispute there, but I think, you know, common wisdom is Goodbye Yellow Brick Road number one, Honky Chateau number two for Elton John. We'll be talking more about Elton John in an upcoming video called Elton John Meets the Beach Boys. Another famous 1-2 combo from that same time period, you've got Joni Mitchell Blue, typically ranked as her top album, followed by my personal favorite, Court and Spark, which I love Blue, but the instrumentation on here is more varied, and I find it, I pull this out and play it more often, but both great albums. Now, you get a little further, like the Rolling Stones. I think nowadays, most people, including myself, would rate Exile on Main Street as the greatest Rolling Stones album, which apparently always mystifies Mick Jagger, who says it's just a collection of songs from a different periods, all put together in this collection. But it does seem to hold together as a cohesive unit, even though it's difficult for the participants to see it that way. And I think then most people, now somebody might do Beggar's Banquet as number two or Let It Bleed as number two, but I think common wisdom would put Sticky Fingers as the second best Rolling Stones album of all time. So what about the Beach Boys? Now, you could make a case for 2020 from 1969. There's a lot of great songs on here. It's more of a band album. As you can see, Brian Wilson doesn't even appear on the front cover. But the guys stepped up, and there's some really cool Brian Wilson songs on there. But he's not a major participant in this thing. Still a great album. Some people might put that at number two. You've also got what Brian Wilson says are his two favorite albums. Now, I don't think most people would go along with this, but alternately he has said that his favorite Beach Boys albums are Friends, which has some great stuff, but I really don't think most people would put that as the second best Beach Boys album. And he alternately has said that his favorite Beach Boy album is 1977's Beach Boys Love You, which is a really interesting album, very quirky, very unusual. I don't think that there are very many people who would concur with Brian Wilson on either one of those as being the strongest or even the second strongest Beach Boy album. Now, you could also make a case for Holland from 1972, which is a great album, Sail on Sailor, and all the tracks on it are really strong. We've talked about that one before, and we'll talk about it in more depth later. My personal favorite would be Wild Honey from 1967. Now, the songs on Wild Honey are all of a piece. They're all very similar. They're a little rougher, more of an R&B influence, not your typical Beach Boys songs. And the songs on here are not individually as great, certainly, as some of their early work, like California Girls. But I tend to dismiss those early albums from this kind of a listing because prior to 1966, albums were generally a collection of hit singles with some filler. And they don't really hang together as an album. I mean, the tracks are kind of interchangeable between albums. You know, something that's on Summer Days and Summer Nights could be on Beach Boys Today, or something that's on All Summer Long might be on Shutdown Volume 2. I can't even remember sometimes which albums those songs ended up on. It wasn't until 1966 when they began to look at albums as more of a separate piece that should all hang together, you know, with Revolver and Pet Sounds and Sgt. Pepper and those things coming along. So though the songs are not as memorable in and of themselves, to me Wild Honey hangs together best as an album. So that's why I would put it right after Pet Sounds as the best Beach Boy album, not necessarily the best collection of Beach Boy songs. Now, I believe I'm in the minority there. I think a lot of people would say that the second best Beach Boy album, the winner of the coveted Shemp Howard Award, would be 1970's Sunflower, released August 31st, 1970. Now, before we talk about Sunflower, let me put in a little context. Now, the singles chart, you had Close to You by the Carpenters sitting at #1, so there was bubblegum around. Jackson 5 were doing well. They were a new thing. The Temptations, there was a lot of Motown on the chart. But as far as rock albums, Sunflower came out within a couple of weeks of Eric Clapton's self-titled first solo album. Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young Deja Vu had been released that March and was still high on the chart. Their single Ohio about the Kent State shootings was still high on the singles chart at the time that Sunflower by the Beach Boys was released. Within a few days of Sunflower's release, the live Get Your Ya-Ya's Out from the Rolling Stones was released. About a month later, you had the release of Led Zeppelin 3. So into the face of these kind of rock albums came Sunflower by the Beach Boys. Now, this was their first recording released on Warner Reprise. Mo Austin, the head of Warner, liked the Beach Boys, was a big fan. They were very, very pleased to be working with him. They recorded 40 tracks between their prior album, 2020, and the release of Sunflower. And Sunflower went through some name changes. It was originally going to be out in May of '70 under the name Add Some Music to Your Day. They were concerned, they being the record company, were concerned that it was not a particularly strong album. So about half the tracks were replaced, and there was another attempt made to release it as Sunflowers. Again, they listened to it, rejected some of the tracks, went back to the drawing board, and finally, August of that year, the first Warner Reprise album, Sunflower, was released on Warner Reprise from the Beach Boys. There's the back cover. He's got Mike there, Dennis. Everybody has their own little individual photo in the inner sleeve. This certainly sort of flew in the face of other things that were going on in the rock arena. The single, Add Some Music to Your Day, originally the title track before the name change, is a great record. I really love it. It's upbeat, but they're more competing with, I hate to say, the Carpenters than they are with any sort of rock peers of theirs with that, and the single tanked. Interestingly, this is the first album where Dennis comes forward as a writer. There's 12 tracks on this thing. 4 of them are basically Dennis Wilson songs. Now, prior to this, Dennis had, let's go back and look at Dennis. Dennis had done Be Still on the Friends album. He had a couple of co-writes on the prior 2020 album. Within a couple months of this, he would release his first solo single. But he writes Slip On Through, Got to Know the Woman, It's About Time, and Forever. Now, some of these are highly forgettable. Got to Know the Woman, It's About Time are both real attempts to write rockers. I mean, you know, I think he's maybe reacting to the fact that they're not rocking very hard, but they're not very memorable songs. They seem, rather than rocking hard, they just seem a bit frantic to me. They seem like they're sort of flailing away. The vocals are beautiful, but the backing track seems almost frantic to rock, not in the pocket or anything like that. Slip On Through is a little better. It has some of the same characteristics. Now, the final track on this album from Dennis, Forever, has sort of become his signature tune, and it's a beautiful song, very different from the other things on it, more like the things he would go on to do later. But Dennis all of a sudden gets a third of the album after having just some co-write credits and just a few songs before that. Oh, he also wrote the B-side of Breakaway, Celebrate the News, which is a really cool little song. It's a great single, Breakaway, Celebrate the News. Brian is well represented here, probably more than, I would say, more than he had been in a few albums. He adds This Whole World, nice track, kind of one of his classics, so to speak, or second-tier classics. Add Some Music to Your Day, of course. With Mike, he writes a song called All I Want to Do, which again is sort of a throwaway. It's as memorable as the title, All I Want to Do, not to be confused with All I Want to Do, which was a Dennis track on the 2020 album. So you got All I Want to Do and All I Wanna Do is Mike and Brian here. Our Sweet Love is a very, very saccharine. I like it. It's beautiful, but it's very sweet. Sweet being the operative word in Our Sweet Love. He co-writes another with Al, almost equally as sweet, called At My Window, which is a beautiful little song. I like it. I'm a sucker for the sweet songs, and those are 2 of the sweetest of all. Bruce contributes 2 tracks. Deirdre, Brian is listed as a co-writer, but it's basically a Bruce track. It appears on his solo album again in 1977. Pleasant little song, you know, sort of second tier, not Bruce's greatest, but, you know, pretty solid song. Tears in the Morning, which kicks off the second side, is, again, to me, it's forgettable. The track that really stands out is the final track, Cool, Cool Water. But here, for the second album of 3 consecutive albums, they go back and use an old Smile outtake to close the album. On 2020, they did it with Cabanescence. Here they use Cool, Cool Water. And then in 1971 on the Surf's Up album, that will end with the track Surf's Up, of course. There's Bruce. It's a reconstruction apart from the sort of water, 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 water interlude. It's apparently, apart from that, it's a reconstruction. It's not actual Smile tapes apart from that little 40-some-odd second snippet. It's great. That is absolutely first class. Add Some Music to Your Day. I would say is probably first-class Beach Boys. The rest of it, to me, Forever's a great thing to have. This Whole World's great. But a lot of this, to me, is not very memorable, and it doesn't hang together to me as an album. It's a collection of tracks. So I'll stick with my pick for the second greatest Beach Boy album, 1967's Wild Honey. Let me know what you think. Love to hear the comments. Please like and subscribe. See you next time. Bye.